Well, you may or may not notice that I'm having the same guest back in fairly close proximity to when we last met earlier this spring, when we were more locked down as a country. Right now we're in her home, and we're clearly not locked down. We're not doing this on Zoom. We're doing this in person. And the reason that we're visiting with the great Ivy Zelman again is that she's just published her memoir. And I can tell you, writing a memoir, it's a whole different kind of work that you can't describe to others. You have to actually go through writing a book. And I'd like to talk about Ivy being Ivy and what made Ivy today. Welcome. She's the co-founder of Zelman Associates. You just saw her other co-founder, Dennis McGill, blow your brain with the best demographics in the world. Welcome, Ivy.
Thank you for having me again. Great to see you in person.
So let's start off with, because not an enviable position today with the worst supply chain disruption in the history of mankind, but 7 years old, you wanted to be the CEO of Mattel, a toy company?
Well, I think it was probably the only company I knew that was big, and I just knew that I needed to make a lot of money and be successful. So
You were 7.
I was driven.
When you were 7?
I mean, I was into thinking about what ways I would wind up just like my dad, you know, being an executive and thinking about wanting more. So I don't remember, I was laying on the floor in my mother's bedroom while she's making the bed, and I was just laying there with my dogs, and I'm like, Mom, I'm going to own Mattel one day. And she was like, good, honey. Good for you. I mean, I don't know why I said that. I just know that
Well, it makes sense. I mean, it makes sense. That's the one tangible thing in our lives when we're 7 years old.
Right, we knew Mattel.
But your life took a little bit of a right angle when you were 12 years old.
Yes.
You had your formative teenage years in the city of London. What was that like? Talk to us about that.
Well, actually, my dad came home from work, and he worked in Midtown in New York City and worked for an import-export company called London America. And the opportunity came about that he can live overseas for 3 years in London, and we would be there on a contract for 3 years. And so my sisters and I were devastated. I mean, I was in public middle school, junior high school for a month, and we had to leave, and we had to have our dogs quarantined. It was pretty traumatic for all of us, but I wound up living in the suburbs of London. Actually went to an all-girls Christian school, and I'm Jewish. That didn't last very long. We didn't care as much as my dad was like, this is going to be a great experience for you. And I was there for 3 days, and it was way too hard versus the public school. And I did teach the girls how to play netball before I went to the American school, but it was an incredible experience, and some of my closest friends in the world I met while living there. So I look back on that and think it was incredibly transformative for me as an individual.
But you're writing. I mean, you're taking the tube. You're going to concerts.
Yep.
I mean, this is
a lot of independence.
That's the word I was looking for. Thank you. That's a lot of independence at a very young age.
Yes. I think it was like that when we were growing up, though. I mean, I think whether it had been Long Island or...
Yeah. I mean, I was a turnkey kid. I mean, I used to take the public bus home because there was no school bus. So I guess at that same age, I was pretty darn independent myself. And I used to run a little office in my... I used to have like fake money and fake ledgers. And anyways, that's
great.
So in the classroom, a little bit later on in life, you were something of a nudge. You were a little precocious.
Yes.
You actually had an eraser hit your head at some point. What was that all about?
Actually, that was in advanced financial management at George Mason.
Oh,
It was
sorry.
a night class.
So you stayed a nudge.
Yes, always. But I think that one in particular, he was pissed off. Couldn't be more of an opposite individual in a lot of ways. But he wrote a formula on the board, and I pointed out he made a mistake. And it was a number of things that I probably had done. And finally, he just couldn't take it. And everybody was stunned. And I think we took a break. And my friends in the room were like, oh, my God, when we went out of the classroom. But no, early on, I always was a kid, calling out the answer, probably the one that everybody hated for being the loudmouth. When I started college, my dad told me that he did really poorly in statistics. And when I was in this lecture hall with 300 kids, and I just sat in the front row, and as far as I was concerned, it was just me and the teacher and no one else in the room. And I'm sure everybody.
You were the kid in the front row.
Yeah, pain in the ass in the front row. In middle school I wasn't, but in college I was.
So, Ernst & Young, before it was Ernst & Young, you started off as a bean counter.
I did.
I can't square the circle with your personality and an accountant. It's not happening.
Well, actually, when I went to school, I went to night school and I was taking classes and working full time.
Yep.
I was working at Arthur Young as a secretary. I was an admin. And I knew if I got a degree in accounting, my dad told me, no matter what, you'll get a job. And I was good at math. And so I just started taking, classes in accounting, and my major was declared as accounting. But as I started talking to Arthur Young accountants and asking them, do you like your job? Are you happy? I got a lot of them kind of indicating that, it's maybe not for you. That may not be the perfect personality fit. One of my friends, Terry Lloyd, who I'm still friends with from Arthur Young, would laugh. He's like, you need to do something else, Ivy. You need to go to Wall Street. And I think they saw that my personality was a little bit more outgoing and maybe more inclined to interact with people, which in accounting, I learned quickly that you're in a room with a lot of books and numbers and you don't spend as much time working with people.
No. I mean, Arthur Andersen offered me the moon and the world and everything in between my final 9 hours to get to where I could sit for the CPN. I'm just like...
And you knew it wasn't for you.
I'm like, no. And, I mean, but to be fair, looking back all these years, you probably agree, that accounting background remains essential.
Absolutely. I mean, to be able to read a balance sheet and scour through a P&L and cash flow statement, I think that was a great foundation for my analysis today as a stock equity analyst.
People often ask me, what was the most important class you took in business school? And I'm like, managerial accounting. One of the hardest classes I've ever had to take.
Yes.
But I survived it, and it always stayed with me more than anything else. But Wall Street. So you finally get to Wall Street, apparently where you belong. What was your first big break?
Getting a job at Salomon Brothers, and I got there.
And you started there in what capacity?
I got a job working in their 2-year corporate finance program, and it was roughly 70 kids that came from undergrad that were there for 2 years to really as a sort of bridge to whatever else in their future careers, a good training ground, kind of like, a residency at a hospital. Like you work 80 to 100-hour weeks. And I didn't really know that going in, but I knew that everyone told me if you want to make a lot of money and you want to be successful, you have to get a job on Wall Street. And at that time, Wall Street was investment banking. In the late 80s, early 90s, it was all about investment banking. So getting that job was my big break. And actually, I got the job. Fortunately, I'm one of those people that will ask anyone and anyone for help. So even to get an interview on Wall Street was difficult because I came from a very non-traditional background.
Yep.
But getting that job was the break, and my dreams had come true. George Mason had me on the front page of their newsletter with a big picture that their state grad, Ivy Schneider, got a job on Wall Street. So dreams had come true, and getting to Wall Street and working at Salomon, I thought I'd be there forever and I would never leave Solly and I'd never leave investment banking. And I learned very quickly that that wasn't the case.
So what happened next?
Well, like most of the 70 analysts in this program, I tried to go to business school, and I had student loans. I went to night school for 6 years, and I was still paying student loans.
Yep.
But I worked tirelessly to try to get into the best of the brightest. I wanted to go to Harvard, Stanford, Northwestern, and if I'm going to take student loans, it's got to be the best MBA program. Sure. And everyone said, you have to get an MBA. And I would say 99% of the 70 go to get their MBA. But I didn't get into any of those 3 schools. So at that point, I was pretty devastated. I worked so hard on my essays and my GMATs, unlike my SATs and applications for undergrad. So I started looking for a job internally. And fortunately for me, Salomon Brothers had a scandal, which you may recall, with John Goodfriend. And unfortunately, the demise of what was perceived the demise of Salomon Brothers created a lot of openings at Solly. So we're in the midst of a recession. My job was ending in June of 92. So earlier in 91, when I knew I wasn't getting into any of the business schools, I started looking internally. And Julius Maldutis, who was the airline analyst that I worked with as part of the transportation team at Corporate Finance, recommended me for a role in equity research under Bruce Harding, who was doing the firm a favor because Bob Bishop, who was our equity housing analyst, he thought the lights were going out at Solly and he left. And he
Uh-huh.
went to be buy side. Now he's actually one of my top clients running Impala as the chief investment officer. But at the time, there was an opening. Bruce decided to help Solly out, pick up the home building and building product stocks because he covered S&Ls. And Julius recommended me and Bruce hired me. So, and for me, I was just so happy to have a job to pay my rent.
Sure.
And I was told, all the investment bankers are like, you don't want to go to work in equity research. They're just monkeys. They just write what management teams tell them to write, and you're going to hate it. So these were my confidants, my friends, and I really didn't care. I just wanted a job. And I had some idea, but it was to pay the rent.
So we know, looking back, that you were no monkey in equity research, that you didn't let anybody guide your views. But how was it to be kind of on Wall Street in that era? You know, I started in '96. It was definitely a boys' club then. You were kind of a tomboy on Wall Street, which is kind of hard for me to wrap my head around, but that's how you described it.
Yeah. You know, I think growing up in the suburbs of New York, out in Long Island, I always talk about, you know, I lived off of exit 62 off the LA. Everybody says that I lived along Long Island. We're out in a place near Stony Brook. And it was a public school. I mean, my graduating class was 1,000 kids. Mm-hmm. And I'm one of 3 sisters. And I was definitely athletic. And we'd get into physical altercations, you know, whether it be with my sisters or, you know, neighborhood girls. And we were tough.
Yeah.
And so being in a man's world just felt natural for me. And I never even thought about being a woman. It was more, I'm just going to kick these guys' asses. I'm going to go in here and show them how it's done, whether woman or man. And I'm not saying there wasn't hard times, but I could swear like the best of them. I can hang in the locker room. It didn't matter.
Look at the top of the next page. It says potty mouth.
Total potty mouth. But I didn't, I mean, if a man, I'll give you an example, and this is probably not politically correct, but, you know, I had a CEO once say to me when I was pregnant with my 3rd child, walking out, he said, you know what? You sure have a good ass for a pregnant woman. And I looked at him and I said, thank you. So as far as I was concerned, I'm okay with that, you know? And maybe I shouldn't be. And I now appreciate it could be viewed as inappropriate, but I didn't let things faze me. And if guys were flirting with me or they were joking around, talking about stuff, what they did the night before, I would just get right in the conversation and give them shit for it. So it didn't bother me.
And that's how I was. That was how you had to be.
If you were too
survive.
sensitive, you would never make it. Mm-mm. And you can't be sensitive. If you're going to be in a boys' world, a man's club, you're going to have to learn how to have thick skin.
Yeah, I had to live down the nickname of Stapler because on my first day at work, I asked for a stapler. And I was told that I was lower than the whale shit on the bottom of the ocean and that I should never ask anybody for anything ever again. So it was one of these things.
Stapler, I love it.
Yeah, Stapler DiMartino. That was a lot of fun. But so talk a little bit about, because this is something that I dealt with as well. Talk about, is it a service or a disservice that Wall Street is such a club of Ivy Leaguers?
Well, it depends on who you're asking. You know, coming from a non-Ivy League background, it was intimidating. I feel like the elitism was, you know, so alive and obvious to me that I never fully felt like I belonged. It's just funny because looking back, now I'm doing this almost 30 years. I don't know if it was 10 years ago, I lose track of time, but I ran into a bunch of Solomon guys that my husband was having dinner with, and I went and met them for a drink. And I remember chatting with one of them, and this guy, John, is like, we were so intimidated by you. And I was like, what? You were intimidated by me?
Yeah.
He's like, yeah, you were like in those classes that we had to take, because we did like 6 weeks of training. You were the only one that knew the answers to those accounting questions. You were the only one that, because most of these kids that come in are like poets, they call them, the English major, the history majors, because they know how to think as opposed to those that, you know, are more on the finance accounting side that are
analytical.
Well, analytical and more rote learning, they whatever it may be. But I was just blown away that they were intimidated by me. And I said, how could you be intimidated by me? He says, well, how'd you get in? You came from this non-traditional background, or you weren't from an Ivy League school.
You knocked on the damn doors.
So I had to knock on a lot of doors, and I was pretty deflated. I remember going to what I call an information interview, where you go and try to learn about the opportunities, and one was at Prudential and one was at Dean Witter, and both were women. It was HR, and it was a friend at Arthur Young, might have been a boss where they audited that client, would you meet this woman? She's really, unique. And they pretty much, both women, completely independent of one another, told me that I didn't have what it took to get a job at Wall Street. And I walked out of both of those completely deflated, just feeling like I'm never going to get a job at Wall Street. But I didn't give up, and I did my homework, and I read a ton of books, and I kept asking until finally a guy at the gym where I folded towels and worked out, sort of a barter, he said, I know some guy on Wall Street I can introduce you to. And sure enough, CJ DeSantis, who worked at Merrill Lynch in fixed income, agreed to meet me for an informational interview. And that was a turning point. And had I not met with CJ 2 hours prior to a real interview at Salomon Brothers, that Dave Wilson, who was the partner that ran all of our region, that was incredibly generous to take me under his wing and got me a real interview. And the guy that ran HR at Salomon, he says, we don't meet with non-Ivy League students or graduates. And he said, you need to meet this woman. She's special.
I don't think that the sell side has changed that much since Sarbanes-Oxley, since the financial crisis. I mean, it still kind of reads the same, smells the same, feels the same. But you've done things differently from day one. How did that evolve as the 90s turned into the aughts years? And it was obvious that housing was starting to run hotter than maybe what was justified.
Well, it really started out ironically because I covered such a small space, and I launched in August of '93 on 4 home building stocks. And I remember the sales force wouldn't have anything to do with me at Salomon Brothers. My stocks in total represented less than 0.5% of the S&P 500. So you really couldn't get them to take you to see investors. They were just more reluctant because it would put them at reputational risk.
Right.
So the best way to differentiate yourself is to go out and talk to private companies and learn from them. And my industry was so fragmented. When I first started covering the home builders, they represented less than 10% of all of new home sales. So it was easy to find large private home builders, whether it be at industry associations, through conferences. And so I had to find a way to get that client to call me back. And how do you do that? With information they're not reading in a 10Q or 10K or annual report. So that motivated me to learn as much as I can that would provide them incremental valuable information. So then I actually got through to a few clients that were willing to take my call to hear what I have to say. But I also would ask them a ton of questions. Like, what do you think's missing in the analysis that the sell side does? What's your view of the housing market? Which stocks do you like? What do you think of this management team? And then I would have a little bit of what I tell them, what I'd learned from private builders. And they'd hang up that call and they'd be like, she's awesome. And I barely would maybe say anything. I just asked a lot of questions about them. And then they started telling their sales force or their salesperson, Ivy Schneider's really good. And then the sales force was willing to take me out. So it's kind of backwards, but I think it was being forced to get attention through providing nuggets that no one else had. And that was the only way to get investors to really pick up that call and want to hear from me on the next time I picked up the phone. And then it became self-fulfilling because then the sales force likes you, and then the next thing you know, other salespeople are willing to take you out. So I think that digging was by force.
At some point here in the timeline, something called children started coming along. When did that happen? How did it affect your tenacity, if at all? I doubt it did. But how did the advent of becoming a mother working on Wall Street, how did that work? I mean, I left Wall Street before I started having kids, but how did that work?
It's just like anything, you just do it. I mean, I remember my mother being worried that I was never going to get married and have kids because I was working so much. And at one point I wasn't sure I would either. I was just,
Guilty as charged.
Focused, but I met a man at work, so I met David at Salomon Brothers, and, he could handle me. My dad joked at my wedding, she looked everywhere. She looked in Europe, she looked in Asia, she looked in the US. This is his speech at my wedding. I'm like, thanks, Dad. He's, well, eventually you found someone that could put up with you. But really, David wanted a family and was very clear that if we're going to get serious, at some point, I want to move to Cleveland, where I want to raise my family close to my parents. And so I in Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio. And I was like, where's Cleveland? I was, no idea. And I never thought he'd actually want to move because he's such a party guy and loves, great restaurants, music. So we got married, I got pregnant, and we moved to Cleveland. And I was a little devastated, I'll be honest, admittedly, initially. And yet when I was there, I went from a small apartment into, 5,000 foot square home, which was a huge home.
Yeah.
And
you go around and go, I can fit like 5 apartments.
Yeah. And I'm driving
incredible.
a car, and David's family was great, and all his friends that he grew up with since elementary school were there.
Yep.
And they had kids. But being a professional on Wall Street, being a mother, you're not given any, sort of advantage or freedom to like, oh, go be your mom. You're expected to do everything what you always have done, including traveling. So really it was about great support, having people around you that you trust. But I think it's just like anything else. You just do it. And even being on maternity leave, is not really a true maternity leave. You're available. You're available 24/7. And I think that Wall Street, it's expected. So you're not afforded that luxury
no.
of taking time off. And that's why a lot of women leave the workforce, unfortunately, at least the Wall Street workforce.
Yeah, I mean, when my twins were born, Bear Stearns was blowing up. So it wasn't an option at the Federal Reserve at that point to kind of say, I'm on maternity leave. I've got twins in the NICU.
Yeah.
It distracted my mind at the time to think about Bear Stearns instead of, the 2 little heartbeat monitors. Anyways.
Oh my God.
Oh, it was
Must
crazy.
Have been scary.
By the way, can you please share your children's names?
Yes.
Because I run around going Z squared, Z squared, Z squared.
Zoe, Zachary, and Zia.
Was that obviously by design?
Well, Zoe was one of my favorite names, and I love the double Z. But at the time, we decided we weren't going to find out if we were having a boy or girl, so we went with Zoe or Zach. And then when we had number 2, we were going to go with Zach or Nikki, so it was Zach. And then we said, well, we got to stick with the Z theme now. So we actually made up the name Zia. We were thinking of names, I'm like, things that rhyme, and Mia, oh, Zia. So, and she fits the name Zia pretty good, I'll tell you that.
I literally walk around with Z squared going through my
And we have dogs, Zozo and Xander, and we had to put down Zilly.
I know.
So we've definitely got a Z theme going on.
You've got 2 puppies.
Yep, 6 months.
Love dogs.
Yes.
Okay, so let's move on. Let's move on to the sticking to your guns, the housing call. To how was that? I mean, that's how we met. That's why we met. It was not a fun life.
Right, you were contrarian as well.
I was talking to this young economist named Jan Hatzius about mortgage equity withdrawal and how it was juicing consumption. And he was like, no, this is originally Alan Greenspan's series. And I mean, wonky, geeky stuff. But I'm sitting there saying, many of these people are pulling out of their homes and they're getting mortgages pretty easily to do it. So anyways, you saw what was coming and you started to be public about that at a sell-side firm. I mean, at least I was retired off Wall Street by then. I was at the Dallas Morning News. I had security. I was getting death threats, but I was sure as hell not on the sell side saying what you were saying. How did that evolve?
Well, I built a network of private companies, as I mentioned earlier, that at the time was several hundred. And having the ability to have your hand on the pulse on a daily basis, boots on the ground, talking to builders and mortgage companies and realtors, but predominantly home builders, and them telling you that it was crazy and stupid, telling you all the time about the land inflation and how they can't pencil returns, or how they're selling to investors, and there's a tremendous amount of speculation in the market. I think it was grounded in having that perspective and constantly triple checking, whatever I had to against the realtors. What are they saying? Are they saying the same thing? Or what are the mortgage companies saying? I remember being with mortgage companies who are like, yeah, we're just giving people, we're approving people that don't have jobs. And be like, how can you do that? Well, we could sell those loans to Fannie Freddie. So I think it was a constant confirmation of what we were learning in the field, and then triangulating it with the data that we had that was showing affordability was just completely out of reach. So knowing it wasn't sustainable, and there was such a a perception that there was a secular shift and homeownership was going to go to 70%, and the numbers just were not adding up. And everything that we had ever analyzed was telling us with red, blaring lights, this is not sustainable, this is not right. And so we started really doing a lot of work around investors. And that was when we were very vocal about our negative view. We first published a report in July of '05 called Investors Gone Wild. And it was really an aggregation of really sizing the amount of investors in the market. It was a 50-page deep dive thematic report, and we had like 1,000 people at our conference call. So every part of Credit Suisse, every aspect of the firm cared what we were saying, and there were people within the firm that were in agreement with us, but the majority disagreed.
Of course.
And there were, definitely some, say, roads were difficult to navigate through being at a bureaucratic firm, but I had a great team. Dennis McGill, who's my co-founder at Zelman, was an intern and became a full associate, and others along the way that helped us all to really stick to what we believe, because we were doing the research. And it's hard you can't consciously ignore it. Or if you do, I don't know how you go forward. And I remember being on conference calls and management teams, they would say that I was a jihad. I was at war against them. And I would ask questions and investors would be like, why is she asking about FICO scores? And why is she asking about debt to income ratios? And I was focused on the mortgage piece. And I just got clients that were getting pissed off and telling their salespeople, she's asking questions that don't matter. And she's, trying to find information that doesn't have any impact on the home building business. So we were triangulating the various silos, the mortgage mostly with the brokerage community, with the home builders. And most sell-side analysts stay in their lane and they only analyze the stocks that they cover. So that got us into trouble by, veering outside of our lane.
Yep. I feel like we just had a conversation about the last 2 months in the housing market, but moving on. Detractors. There's a lot of detracting going on today. If you're not a crypto enthusiast, if you don't believe that Fed liquidity is the only game in town, if you don't believe that valuations, if you believe that valuations, there's a lot of detracting going on today for anybody who dares to speak out. And it's one of the parts of your book was pretty. It opened up some wounds for me.
By willing to be a detractor.
There were some pretty mean things that were done and said.
Yeah.
How did you navigate that?
A lot of tears, my guess. Tough days. I think that I had experienced some major backlash from even people I worked with internally, threatening me that thinking they're my friend, if you don't, turn bullish, you're going to ruin your career. I think there were a number of times where I lost confidence and, would go home and cry to David and be like, he's like, just do what you have to do. And I think it was those hard days that made the next day where you get up and you just call a few more of your contacts and you just check and triple check the work that you've been doing. But it wasn't fun to not be popular, and I don't know that I know how to do anything different. So I just had to grin and bear it, and fortunately I had Dennis and Justin and then later Alan and Melinda and people around me that, were really supportive. So I couldn't have gone it alone, that's for sure. I was never alone in it. I was with a group, and even Dennis and I will talk back on those days, and you do lose confidence. You always question yourself, am I wrong? Like, what am I missing? And I think it's those people that really are the most successful, are the ones that are willing to ask themselves, where am I wrong? Like, what am I missing? And not get complacent in their own view and just constantly testing themselves and their philosophy.
So at some point, you branched out on your own. What was leaving Wall Street? That must have been a massive leap, and the risk you're taking on, and having employees you're responsible for. I'm starting to channel myself through you because having having the responsibility of having employees is really stressful. But what made you say, I'm going to go do this on my own?
It wasn't an overnight decision. I think like everything, I was pretty methodical and prudent about approaching it. But I recognized that this, industry Rolodex that I had built had value. And I was really able to provide incremental information that no one else could. It was differentiated. Marry that with internally not feeling the love and support during those tough periods, and then triangulating that with being told to stay in your lane and thinking, I can go do this on my own, and then I can expand beyond home building and building products and go do mortgage and go do every other thing, multifamily, the home centers. And that was compelling to do a more
You were creating your own new lanes on the highway.
And I wanted it. I think if anything, it was a combination of that and recognizing that while Credit Suisse was great to me financially, I was being remunerated for how home building stocks traded. And didn't matter that I got on a plane and went to talk with PIMCO or did work for the asset-backed guys. Whatever I was doing, I was remunerated on only one very small slice of really my full job. And I started recognizing that, you know what? I could take my franchise and go hang my shingle and call it Zelman. And I thought it would be so easy. So had I known how hard it was going to be, I don't know that I would have done it. But I also had support of my husband, who was in agreement that, he's like, you're crazy. You make good money. Why would you take that risk? And when he knew I was going to do it, he decided to jump in and help. And he really was the person on the business side, helping to get the broker-dealer license. Yep. So I was able to focus on doing research, but there were so many things that I didn't expect, like having to get paid. Like as a broker, as a vendor, a sell-side research firm, I never knew how Credit Suisse got paid, or dealing with HR issues and dealing with, accounts receivables and payables and all the things that are, you're like, oh my God. But I did say, well, if it doesn't work out, I can always get a job. And that's how I felt. And I was crazy too, because my kids were in 2007 were 3, 5, and 7. I mean, how nuts was I? I mean, in hindsight, it was really
the only thing
insane.
You had behind you was potty training. That was it.
It felt like that in hindsight. But I have to tell you, when you turn 40, and that's roughly when I made the decision, the kite never flies high enough. I admittedly was feeling like I had grown a little complacent. And to me, complacency is like almost equivalent to death. Boredom and not feeling challenged, that I just needed that kite to fly higher. And it's kind of been what's pushed me into my life. It's just wanting more and not knowing what more is, but knowing it's not going to stay this way.
So if you don't mind discussing it, you are a breast cancer survivor.
I am.
How's that worked with your golf swing?
Not as good as I'd like, unfortunately, but
golf was helpful.
I loved playing golf and played golf since I was 10 years old. And so I remember my dad was shocked because I gave up playing golf, even though I was really good, because I was in the suburbs of England and I was having fun with my friends and I wanted to go hang out with them and not play golf. So he was bummed. Still played occasionally, but really gave it up. And then in my late 20s, I realized the Zelman brothers had all these boondoggles, we called it, where you'd go, Del Webb, which was publicly traded back then, would have these Sun City excursions, and you'd go and everybody would go sit in meetings, and then they'd go play golf.
Go play golf.
So I said to my dad, I want to play golf again, and he was thrilled. So I went to Houston, and he suited me up, and said, you still got it. You still can, you can kill a ball. So started playing, muscle memory. And then breast cancer changed that. So it was hard to deal with breast cancer, but the consequences of breast cancer really didn't become that apparent till way later. But I think when I found out that I had cancer, I admittedly tend to be a realist about things. I wasn't afraid of dying. I just, was like, how long is this going to take? I mean, it was kind of like, okay.
Ever the pragmatist, Ivy. Ever the pragmatist.
My husband just was dying over me because I had my first lumpectomy, which was followed by a second lumpectomy, which was followed by a mastectomy, and then there was more problems post-mastectomy. But after my lumpectomy, I was on painkillers and from the surgery, and I was on the phone talking to salespeople or clients, and he's like, to the Salesforce memo, do not let Ivy talk to anyone on Percocet. So it was kind of like, this can't get in my way. I'm not going to stop. And I never really worried about it, but it just kept coming and just kept coming. And there were some really dark days, but I think you focus on, as a survivor, like the importance of health and recognizing the most important thing is your family. And my dad really helped me, who I adore. And he said to me, you need to recognize that on your tombstone, it's not going to say Ivy Zelman, the housing analyst. You hope it doesn't. You hope it says Ivy Zelman, a loving mother. And realizing what was really important. And I think there were days that it was tough to get out of bed and feeling sorry for myself. And I think that's where my husband really came in and kicked my ass. He's like, you've got 3 babies that need you to get up and go take care of them. So having the kids made it easier, because I can see where you can, get yourself into a negative state and stay there.
So I'm going to finish up with something on a very personal note, because I've become your friend over the last few months. You have very strong feelings about not just work, not just balance in your life, family and work. You have very strong feelings about the importance of friends in your life. And I think you can share some wisdom with the viewers, because I think that that's something that a lot of people let go by the wayside in life and shouldn't.
Right. Well, for me, really the friends in my life are my family. Like the women that are at my side from, elementary school to, meeting women 15 years ago that I met through, like Jennifer, through my daughter's kindergarten class and being friends with her son. But I think, when I meet people and I connect, like, you'll never get rid of me now. I will be always reaching out and being proactive and trying to see how you're doing and being vulnerable with you and letting you know who I am. And I think all of us are kind of apprehensive at times to really be open and talk about your real feelings or what's going on with you. And I think having that connection with other women has really been the key to my success, to having them at my side through thick and thin. Most of the time on the phone bitching about the kids or complaining about what your husband did wrong. And you need that sounding board, but also to encourage you and lift you higher.
Sure.
And be there when you are either
so
laughing or crying.
You've seen worse than this, Ivy. Move on. Move on.
Absolutely. It's really the ingredients of my success. And I don't know what I would do without them. I just got back from a girls' trip in Dublin, Ireland. You should have came with us.
Yeah, I saw those pictures. I'm like, damn, I wish I would have been there.
But it's making sure you make time for that.
Right.
And not, like too many women, especially when they have kids, they can't go, or their husband is, not around to take care of the kids. And I just think you have to make time for your friends and make that, extra half an hour in your day to call them and check in and ask them how they're doing. I think those things really ultimately give you big payback.
Yeah, I just reunited with 13 of my closest friends, 2 of which I hadn't seen in more than a decade in Italy.
That's incredible.
Our takeaway was,
we need to do this more often.
Shame on us. Shame on us. Look how good we feel.
Right.
So
lots of laughing. Laughter. They say that laughter is the best medicine. Right. Absolutely.
All right. So we haven't talked about housing, and we're not going to, because I want for everybody to go out and read "Give Me Shelter." Be sure and give "Give Me Shelter," great Rolling Stone song, to your daughters especially. I highly recommend it. And I want to thank you for all your time this afternoon and how inspiring your memoir is to so many individuals, whether they be men, women, children, but especially friends. And thanks for inviting us up to your world. And I look forward to talking about housing. We'll talk about that in 6 months.
Wonderful. Thank you. Really appreciate it.